In the late 1920s, Fujimoto began design work on the next class of Japanese heavy cruisers, and he had to take many factors into consideration when deciding on the main armament. During this time frame, the Furutakas, Aobas, and Myokos were either in commission or were being commissioned and were undergoing gunnery trials. During these trials, it was found that the dispersion of the main battery guns for Japanese heavy cruisers was less than desirable, as on average, the dispersion was anywhere from 400 to 500 meters. The Japanese were aiming for dispersion rates around 300 meters or less, so they were achieving anywhere from 25 to 40% more dispersion than they anticipated. There were also 8-inch guns installed aboard the aircraft carriers Akagi and Kaga. These were in the B-type turret, which had a maximum elevation of 70 degrees to allow the 8-inch guns to have a dual-purpose role. However, it was found that the 20-centimeter gun was not adequate for anti-aircraft duties. The final consideration Fujimoto had to keep in mind was the Washington and the soon-to-be-signed London Naval Treaties, which meant Japan was effectively maxed out on the heavy cruisers they were allowed to construct, so in order to build more classes in the future, they would have to find some kind of a loophole. Ultimately, the solution to all of these problems would be found in developing a new naval gun, which was handed over to the 1st Division of the Navy Technical Department, headed by naval engineer Chiyokichi Hata. He was responsible for designing most of the Japanese Navy's medium and large caliber guns and their respective mounts from the 1920s until his death in 1943. However, with him having died before World War II came to a conclusion, much information on the development of Japanese naval guns went to the grave with him. What we do know about the development for the guns and mounts is that they were largely based on the 20-centimeter 50 caliber 3rd-year type No. 2 guns, Model E turret. These were the guns and turrets that would be installed aboard the new Takao-class heavy cruisers, and modernized variations would be installed on all future heavy cruisers. We also know, based on the designation of the gun itself, that its breech's design was completed in 1930, as the 3rd year in the designation of the gun stands for the 3rd year of the Showa era, which began on the 25th of December, 1926. The guns and mounts would both be ordered from the Kure Naval Arsenal respectively, and their designated staff would oversee the working plans and construction of both. 3 guns and 1 mount would be constructed and undergo firing trials in the early 1930s, and once both proved a success, a supply of 60 would be ordered for the first 4 Mogami-class cruisers, with a follow-up order for an additional 30 for the last 2 Mogami-class cruisers. However, the Mogami class had a series of issues, and the final 2 ships of the class were cancelled, and the Toneis were constructed in their place, which were completed with 20-centimeter guns, so the second order of 30 weapons was never completed, and in total, the Japanese only manufactured 80 barrels. They also failed to complete the order of mounts for these weapons, with only 20 turrets having been completed, which were all installed across the 4 Mogami-class cruisers. A unique feature about the 15.5-centimeter triple mount is that dimensionally it was nearly identical to that of the 20-centimeter dual mount, and this meant that the 2 turrets were interchangeable within the same size barbette, with the only real alterations having to occur on the roller path. The roller path for the triple mount was roughly 5.5 meters in diameter, and for the dual mount it was roughly 5.2 meters in diameter. In early 1939, with the Japanese having pulled out of any foreign treaties, they opted to upgun the Mogami-class cruisers to the 20-centimeter gun, and this was completed by the end of the year. From this moment forward, the turrets and guns would have a rather interesting life, as, since the upgrade to the Mogami class had happened, the Japanese now knew that the secondary armament for the Yamato class was going to be the 15.5-centimeter gun, rather than the 20-centimeter gun, which was also considered. A new light cruiser was also under development, which would end up being the Oyodo, and it was decided that the 15.5-centimeter gun would make up its primary armament. Once the 2 Yamato-class battleships were completed, along with the 1 Oyodo, 10 turrets were in use, along with 30 guns. This left 50 guns in excess with 10 turrets. The Japanese did intend to construct more Oyodo-class light cruisers, but unfortunately the project was halted only after Oyodo was built, and so the other turrets and guns would never be installed aboard the cruisers, and the turrets and guns themselves would, for the most part, be left in warehouses within the Kure Naval Arsenal and on Etajima Island. By the time World War II came to a conclusion, the Japanese began repurposing the guns and turrets, with one turret being installed at Kure and one at Sasebo for anti-aircraft and coastal defense purposes, while roughly 25 guns were installed on single mounts in various cities across Japan. In 1944, between Yamato and Musashi, 4 turrets and their respective guns were removed from the ships and placed in storage at Kure, and this is where they would be discovered at the end of World War II, though for the most part, the surviving turrets and guns were badly damaged by US bombing raids. As far as guns go, these were the most intact pieces that the United States found due to their installation in various locations across Japan. However, when it came to the turrets themselves, this was less desirable as only one unit was found largely undamaged, though several components were missing, and so undamaged components had to be taken from the 2 storage locations. All in all, the United States was able to compile enough components to make up 1.5 turrets. Throughout 1946, the United States Navy would inspect and test the guns and mounts, and by the end of the year, they had completed a report that outlined the functionality of both. After the United States had completed their investigation, they ordered that all of the guns and turrets be scrapped, leaving the only 2 examples aboard the wrecked Oyoto, which was raised and scrapped in 1948, so as far as I am aware, there are no surviving examples of this weapon. With the history out of the way, let's take a closer look at the performance of the guns and mounts themselves, since the whole purpose of their development was to increase the performance and flexibility of Japan's cruisers. The dispersion of the guns was still found to be unsatisfactory, though there was a slight improvement over the preceding heavy cruisers. Obviously, we have to mention the arrangement of the turrets in comparison to the preceding heavy cruisers, since the Japanese had installed turrets 3 and 4 within the superstructure. This allowed a different arrangement of the turrets and theoretically a tighter grouping of the shells between turrets. Unfortunately, there was still a significant gap noticed between the forward 3 turrets and the after 2 turrets. As for an individual turret itself, in order to prevent the blast from a gun interfering with the blast of another, there was a time delay between guns firing, from right to left, of 0.1 second. This was found not to be enough. When the turrets were installed aboard the Yamatos, various improvements were made to them, and this included increasing the time delay between the guns to 0.3 seconds. This slight increase in time delay made a noticeable difference in the dispersion of the shells from a single turret. Initially, the average dispersion for a Mogami-class cruiser was found to be about 375 to 400 meters, though later in their careers with these turrets, it would be reduced to about 300 to 350 meters. When going over to the Yamatos, we would see an average long-range dispersion of roughly 275 to 300 meters for the secondary battery. Next, we have the anti-aircraft role for these guns, which was supposed to be a significant improvement over the 8-inch gun, which was virtually worthless as an anti-aircraft piece, and it was found very early on with the Mogami that the 15.5 centimeter gun was equally useless. When Mogami and Mikuma were completed, the turrets had 4 shell hoists installed to service the 3 guns, as the 4th shell hoist was to be used during anti-aircraft operations to increase the flow of shells to the guns to keep a high rate of fire. The design of the shell hoist was supposed to allow 8 shells to be passed to the turret per minute. Unfortunately, the hoist did not perform as anticipated, and they could barely keep up with 5 shells per minute. The elevation of the guns was also controlled by a piston gear type system. This was a rather slow system, only capable of moving guns up and down 10 degrees per second, and when at extreme high elevations, basically 55 degrees and higher, the system was prone to failure and the guns would jam. So, later in the Mogami's career, and throughout the entirety of Yamato's and Oyoto's career, the guns had a maximum elevation of 55 degrees rather than their initial 75 degrees. Combine the poor elevation with the slow training of the turret of 6 degrees per second, and the guns were unable to keep up with aircraft. By the time World War II started, thanks to all of the factors working against the guns in an anti-aircraft role, the Japanese removed the fourth hoist from the turret, and they had no serious intention of using these guns in an anti-aircraft role. That statement kind of works against what the Japanese ended up doing during World War II, since they installed various guns across Japan for the purpose of being used as an anti-aircraft piece. However, due to the poor characteristics of the weapon in the anti-aircraft role, the whole concept was just to have more shells flying in the sky, since the Japanese had all of these guns laying around, and they really didn't have any expectation they would shoot down aircraft. There is one redeeming feature for these weapons, though, in respect to an anti-aircraft role, and this was the installation of the center barrel within the triple mount turret. The centerline spacing between the guns was 1.55 meters. This meant that when the center breech mechanism was opened, it could interfere with either the left or right gun, depending on which side it would open towards. In order to prevent this issue from happening, the Japanese adjusted the center breech mechanism at a 45-degree angle upwards, so that it did not interfere with either of the guns on the sides. This installation method meant that the breech mechanism for the center gun would not interfere with the loading process on the right or left gun, and this meant that the maximum rate of fire could theoretically be sustained. With that out of the way, I wanted to take a closer look at the turrets as they were installed aboard the Yamato in comparison to the Mogami and Oyoto, as various improvements were made to the turrets for the battleships. The turrets were designed with two 100 horsepower electric motors, which would supply power to various machinery that would allow the turret to operate on its hydraulic machinery, with the hydraulic pumps themselves being filled with mineral oil. However, it was found in the Mogamis that the hydraulic pumps were loud. For the Yamato and Musashi, the hydraulic pumps would be installed outside of the turret so that the operators would not be interfered by the noise. Another major alteration that had to be done to the turrets has to do with their 8-meter rangefinders. Firstly, not all of the turrets on the Mogami class had their own rangefinders, only turrets 3 and 4 did. When we go over to the Yamato and Musashi, all 4 of the turrets that the two battleships had would have rangefinders. The position of the rangefinders was also altered. On the Mogami class cruisers, the rangefinder was mounted at the rear of the turret and it sat rather low, so it partially cut into the rear of the gunhouse. For Yamato and Musashi, the rangefinder would be moved more towards the center of the turret, and it would be raised up on top of the turret, so it did not cut into the gunhouse at all. Another alteration to the turret is less noticeable, but it is the installation of heat protection hoods. The distance between the hood and the turret itself was about 9 centimeters or 3 inches, and the concept was that the hood would take the heat from the sun, then the space in between the hood and the turret would allow air to cool down, and the temperature within the turret would naturally be kept to a minimum. There is some speculation as to how well this system worked, as in 1946 the United States suggested that the Japanese should have also installed another hood with on the inside of the turret, though if the Japanese were to do this, this would cramp the space within the turret, and ideally they would have to build an all-new turret of greater size. Since the whole idea for the Yamato secondary armament was to repurpose the Mogami's main battery turrets, they weren't going to be building new turrets in order to install a hood within the inside of the turret. The final alteration I wanted to mention has to do with the number 1 and 4 15.5 centimeter guns on Yamato and Musashi, since they were on an extreme elevated position so they could fire over the tops of the number 2 and 3 46 centimeter turrets. The number 1 barbette stood at a height of 6.4 meters, or 21 feet. The number 4 barbette stood at a height of 5.2 meters, or 17 feet. The average barbette for these turrets was only 25 millimeters thick, but since the number 1 and 4 barbettes for Yamato and Musashi were so exposed, the Japanese increased the thickness to 75 millimeters so that they were better protected from small caliber fire and splinter damage. Those are all of the major alterations I wanted to go over for the Yamato and Musashi. And to finish this video off, I wanted to look at the ammunition types that were supplied to these guns, as there were only 3 shells. The Type 91 armor-piercing shell, the Type 0 high-explosive shell, and an illumination shell. The armor penetration for the armor-piercing shell was adequate for destroyers and light cruisers, but if it had to go up against actual armored targets, its performance began to decrease significantly. What's interesting is that when the Mogami-class cruisers had their turrets removed, the Japanese suspended and cancelled the production of the Type 91 armor-piercing shell, and in the post-war environment, this led many to believe that the Yamato and Musashi never had armor-piercing shells for their secondary guns. That has since been proven factually incorrect, as though the Japanese were no longer producing the Type 91 shell, they still had a hefty supply in reserve, and this meant that in late October of 1944, Yamato recorded that it fired 127 Type 91 shells, along with 383 Type 0 shells. Based on those numbers, it's logical to assume that the Yamato and Musashi carried more high-explosive shells than armor-piercing, but they still had them nonetheless. With that having been said, that is all I wish to cover on these guns for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.